Today, we're diving into the story of two giants of the ancient world. One, a preacher whose words would end up building a brand new faith, and the other, an emperor whose madness would nearly burn an entire empire to the ground. You know, their paths were on a collision course, and that crash was destined to happen right in the heart of Rome.
Okay, so let's get right into it. How in the world did Paul the Apostle, a guy spreading a message of peace and redemption, end up on the radar of Emperor Nero, who is, let's be honest, one of history's most notorious tyrants? Was it just politics? Was it something personal? Or was this clash between two completely opposite ways of seeing the world just inevitable? That's the big question we're going to unpack.
I mean, you really couldn't find two more different people. On one hand, you've got Paul. His entire life's work was about building communities, connecting people, and laying out the core ideas of what would become Christianity. And on the other hand, you have Nero. His reign is pretty much remembered for just cruelty, wild excess, and, well, destruction. Two men, two legacies going in completely opposite directions.
To really understand how they collided, first we have to look at how they each rose to power. So let's track their journeys. They're separate, but they're happening at the same time. One is a spiritual rise, the other purely political.
Now, Paul's story, it starts with this incredible 180-degree turn. See, he wasn't always a believer. Actually, it was the total opposite. As Saul of Tarsus, he was one of the most aggressive persecutors of the early Christians. But then he has this absolutely life-changing experience on the road to Damascus, and it transforms him into the faith's most passionate and, frankly, most influential voice.
And what's just wild here is the sheer scale of his work. This was not some small local thing. Paul went on these massive journeys all across the Roman world. He's setting up churches, writing letters that end up becoming a huge chunk of the New Testament. And let me tell you, this was dangerous stuff. He was constantly running into intense opposition for, challenging the way things were.
So at the very same time that Paul's influence is spreading, a new emperor takes the throne back in Rome. In 54 AD, a young Nero comes to power. And at first, there was a lot of hope. He was guided by his mother, Agrippina, and a pretty smart advisor named Seneca. His early reign actually looked pretty promising. Yeah, well, that hope, it didn't last long. Nero's reign just spiraled into paranoia. He started seeing enemies everywhere, even inside his own family. I mean, he eventually had his own mother executed. And he cleaned house, getting rid of anyone he even thought might be a threat. His rule just became this spectacle of absolute power with zero restraint.
And this brings us to the single event that would slam Nero's political problems right into Paul's growing Christian community, the Great Fire of Rome. This is the moment their two worlds were tragically set to intersect. Just think about that. For 6 solid days, in July of 64 AD, a massive fire just tore through the city of Rome, and it left a huge part of the city in total ruin. The destruction was unbelievable. And the people of Rome were devastated, angry, and they were looking for someone to blame. So this put Nero in a really, really bad spot politically. Rumors were already flying that he might have started the fire himself. Some people even claimed he was playing his lyre while the city burned. He desperately needed to point that public anger somewhere else. He needed a scapegoat, and fast.
And boy, did he find the perfect target. The Christians. They were a small, misunderstood group that a lot of people were already suspicious of. So in a totally calculated move to save his own neck, Nero publicly accused them of setting the fire. And with that, he unleashed a brutal, city-wide persecution against them. The cruelty that came next was just sadistic, and it was theatrical. This quote from the historical accounts, it paints a truly horrific picture. Nero didn't just kill Christians, he made a public show of it, turning their deaths into a form of entertainment to show off his power and scare everyone else into submission.
So, in this climate of absolute terror and persecution, what happens to Christianity's most famous leader? Let's zoom in on Paul's final days and see how this brutal campaign led directly to his arrest and ultimately his execution.
Yeah, there was no way Paul was going to fly under the radar. As the most visible leader of this movement, he was a prime target for Nero's regime. It was only a matter of time. He was arrested and brought right into the belly of the beast, Rome itself, to stand trial. But here's a fascinating little detail. His imprisonment wasn't in some dark, damp dungeon. Paul was actually placed under house arrest. Now this meant he was confined, sure, but he could still have visitors, and crucially, he could still write. It was right here,
during this time that he wrote several of his famous letters, the epistles, and just kept his ministry going right up to the very end.
His final path, on paper, followed Roman legal procedure. But let's be real, the whole thing was rigged from the start. As a Roman citizen, he had the right to appeal his case directly to the emperor. That's what brought him to Rome in the first place. But defending yourself in a court system run by a paranoid emperor who had already branded Christians as public enemies, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was condemned to death.
Paul's Roman citizenship did afford him one last small mercy. While so many other Christians were being crucified or thrown to wild animals in the arena, Roman law said that its citizens should be spared those kinds of humiliating public deaths. So Paul was sentenced to be executed by beheaded.
And this brings us to their legacies. Because here's the ultimate irony. Nero thought he was extinguishing a threat, but the deaths of Paul and the other martyrs, it had the exact opposite effect. Let's take a look at how history ultimately judged these two men.
The long-term outcomes just could not be more different. Nero's power, which seemed so absolute, completely collapsed just a few years later. He was overthrown and ended up taking his own life in 68 AD. Meanwhile, Paul's influence and the Christian faith he championed, it didn't just survive, it grew exponentially in the centuries that followed.
And the contrast is just so stark, isn't it? Paul's execution became a rallying cry. It strengthened the resolve of the early church, and his teachings became fundamental to a religion that now spans the globe. Nero's tyranny, on the other hand, it led to his own downfall, and his name basically became historical shorthand for a cruel, unhinged ruler.
In the end, the very act that was meant to destroy the Christian movement became a source of its strength. The persecution, with Paul's martyrdom as its symbol, created this incredible legacy of sacrifice and conviction that just fueled the faith's spread across the empire and eventually the entire world.
So it leaves us with this final thought. The collision of Paul and Nero is just this powerful case study in two very different kinds of power, right? You've got the temporary power of an emperor versus the enduring power of an idea. And it really forces us to ask, can a martyr's sacrifice ultimately be more powerful, more influential than an emperor's decree? Well, the pages of history seem to have already given us the answer.